Hi, everybody. Welcome to IAM Online. This is Dean Woodbeck from InCommon and Internet 2. Thanks for joining us today. Our moderator today is Michael Geddes from the University of Florida, and I'll turn it over to him to introduce the topic. Michael?
Thank you, Dean. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today's IAM Online, a monthly webinar focused on identity and access management in higher education. IAM Online is brought to you by InCommon, Internet 2, and the EDUCAUSE Higher Education Information Security Council. We're taking questions and comments in the Zoom chat function. Please send those messages during the presentation. I'll do my best to moderate between whomever's speaking and getting your questions in. You'll find the chat button along the bottom of the Zoom screen, and you have to click on the button to see the chat. Today we're talking about Grouper. And it's with Chris Heiser, who leads the Grouper development effort, and provide information about the latest release 2.4. And Bill Thompson will be talking about Grouper deployment. And so we're now on slide 1. As you can see, we want to make sure that everybody understands what Grouper is. It is a lottery in the state of Florida. And no, that's not what we're going to be talking about. But if you want to send me money, I'm happy to go and well, I'll claim to get your ticket for you. Grouper is, well, as we all know, it's a fish, but as we know, there may be packaging concerns. It can be in a container for our Docker fans, and yes, that is a bunch of Grouper down there. So we're not going to be talking about fish. So next slide, please. Now we're on slide 2.4. So we're going to talk about Grouper 2.4. So, Mr. Heiser, if you would please take over.
Hi, everybody. Chris Heiser from the Grouper team. The elusive and long-awaited Grouper 2.4 version is now released. I say August 2018. I think it was August 31st, 2018. We've been working on that for a while, for about 2 years. It's had a lot of substantial enhancements and a lot of small fixes and improvements. Next slide. There's a link to the release announcement. I don't know if that's clickable from Zoom, but you can also Google the Grouper 2.4 release announcement to see that. But basically, the new stuff in there consists of the new UI, which we've been trying to rewrite what we called the admin UI and the light UI for some time, and now we've completely replaced it. The other UIs are removed. If there's something that you need from the other UIs, you can still add that back in if you need, but we'd like people to try to migrate away from those. One of the most recent major features is deprovisioning, where you can more easily try to remove and see what people have access to when they change affiliations in your organization, whether they leave the organization or they get a new job. So that's sort of an exciting one for access management, since we've been focusing on granting access to people, and now we can make sure that people have their access revoked in a timely fashion. Attestation goes along with that. In Grouper, you're going to have what we call ad hoc groups, which are groups that you manually manage, as opposed to ones that are automatically managed from a system of record. And those manually managed groups still need someone to review them, put a pair of eyes on them, and just make sure that even though people still have the same affiliation, they're still an active employee that they need to be in that group. Bill Thompson has done a lot of work on the Grouper deployment guides, I guess I'll say plural. That's going to help you get started with access management, get started with Grouper, do things in a consistent way so that when you talk to people in other institutions, you're sort of speaking the same language. You're not reinventing things that other people have spent time on, and he's going to probably talk more about that. Packaging that Michael mentioned, Tier has spent a lot of effort trying to harmonize packaging across Tier components, and Grouper is one of those. So if you're already deployed with Grouper, you should look into migrating over to the Tier package. And if you're not, then you should start with the Tier package. And again, you'll have that consistency across institutions and best practices. Grouper can send messages out to various messaging systems when events happen. The command line interface called GSH has a revamp, and you can do things like command recall and autocomplete. We've completely updated the third-party packages for Grouper. Next slide, please. So those were the major things. That being said, this is a minor upgrade. There weren't a lot of database changes. There are just a few, and nothing that takes a long time, especially if you're on 2.3 and you're with the latest patches. So if you can please start planning that upgrade. This is what the Grouper team wants to focus on 2.4 because it just takes a lot of time to support multiple versions. So if people can start getting up to that version, then that's what we can focus on. Of course, if there are security issues or major problems in the previous versions, we'll still support those. There's a link to the upgrade instructions from 2.3, and if that's not clickable here, you can easily Google that, or we can provide that to you. Basically, it's going to automatically do everything for you, although one of the LDAP pieces that we upgraded needs some manual reconfiguration. Next slide, please. So as we celebrate releasing 2.4, and I breathe a sigh of relief that no one's going to ask me when 2.4 is going to be released again. We can now focus on the next features and the future of Grouper. And so I'm very interested in what the community thinks. I sent an email out to the Grouper users list today, and if you Google the Grouper roadmap, you can see the prioritized list of things that the Grouper team is going to focus on in the future. We want to release 2.5 next spring. We want to make sure that if you're going to use a feature, it's important to you and you think it's important to the community, that we get that prioritized. Right now, we're working on being able to store configuration in the database so that you don't have all these config files everywhere, and you can centrally manage that with the UI. Templates to be able to create things in Grouper that take a lot of steps. 2 examples of built-in templates would be when you create a new application or a service, it could create a bunch of the folders and privileges and inherited privileges and attributes and things like that for you. And then the tier Grouper deployment guide structure in general, you can click a button and all of a sudden all those folders with the right names and the right structure will be created for you. We're working on improving the real-time loader, specifically working with Michigan to make LDAP loaded groups happen in real time from their from events that come out of their LDAP. We're also working on provisioning to Remedy if anyone wants to sync groups between Grouper and Remedy. Next slide. And some of the things that right now are planned after that are being able to tag tier objects like reference groups, basis groups, authorization groups, so that you can easily manage those and you can easily analyze your authorization groups to see what the policy is. Be able to use the UI to configure which groups to provision to LDAP or AD, or potentially other provisioning targets. One of the things that people have been asking for is to be able to disable loader jobs, so you can keep the configuration there. You can just flick a switch and turn it off for a little while. Configuring the subject source is a part of Grouper that has had a lot of confusion, and so we want to make a wizard in the UI to make that a little bit easier to use. There's another UI feature for permission roles that isn't in the new UI right now that we're going to add. And the last thing is membership reports, so that you could easily pull up, maybe people in a group who aren't active, or maybe an ad hoc SQL query of someone in a group, and be able to see additional attributes of those users, or maybe get a scheduled report. So anyway, those are a couple ideas. If you look at the roadmap, there's a bunch more. And if you can email grouper-core@internet2.edu, we would love to hear from you. I don't know if I'm taking questions or handing off or what, but I will go on mute now.
Well, if there's questions that show up in the chat room, we'll pass those along. I guess at this point, we'll switch over to Mr. Thompson, who will talk about the grouper deployment and governance and so on.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike, and thanks, Chris. Hello, everybody. So we're going to talk about access management strategies for higher education and research and the tiered grouper deployment guide. This content came out of a grouper seminar that we did at the last TechX, and so I'm going to try to give kind of an abbreviated and a little bit of an update, and hopefully folks haven't seen that. It'll be very interesting to them. To start with, I'm going to tell you the three takeaways that you can kind of keep in mind as we go forward. So the first one is that new and old grouper deployments that are interested in a tier-based architecture would do well to start with NIST 800-162 and the grouper deployment guide. I'm going to say a little bit more about that. The second thing is, when you think about grouper, I'd really like you to think about subject attribute management and access policy governance. When you first are exposed to grouper, everybody talks about group management and everything looks like a group, but really want you to try to think about subject attribute management and access governance policy when you think about grouper. And the third thing is, if you do these two things, they will have significant impact on your ability to effectively manage access control at your institution and onboard new services quickly. And the rest of the slide deck is really going to try to highlight those three major points. So, NIST 800-162 and the grouper deployment guide. Lafayette deployed grouper about 3.5 years ago or so now. And when we were doing our initial deployment, we took about 3 months to bootstrap to really just to get ready. And that 3 months was spent reviewing the grouper wiki and all the awesome community contributions that are there. To really try to get oriented about what it is as actually we needed to do to deploy and stand it up, and actually what we wanted to do in terms of our identity and access management architecture. And it occurred to us that that effort and those notes that we had from our efforts, would do well by the community. And so I was happy that the community came together and initiated a project to basically take that and create the group deployment guide. So we spent about a year working with the community, working with the various working groups, and really distilled community practice and turned into a pretty good guide, I think. So really about elevating the discussion to IAM concepts presented in 800-162. So not just about base grouper specific concepts, but really trying to address subject attribute management and access policy governance as presented in 800-162. And so the other thing I might just say about that is, the tier access management strategy meets many of the objectives, many of the attribute-based access control objectives that are in 162. And the one example that always comes to mind is they talk a lot about accommodating the unexpected user in that document. And really what this is speaking to is access control based on attributes, right? So I'm not putting people manually into roles or into groups or managing ACLs or sitting on the end of a help desk queue and putting people in different groups. What I'm really doing is describing my policy based on subject attributes and then letting the system run from there. And so that was pretty exciting to figure out. A little bit of tangent here about why we need a guide. And this is lessons from PyCon 2017. This is a great presentation. If you haven't seen it, highly recommend it. But they talk about documentation for projects. And they talk about 4 distinct types or purposes. 1, tutorials, how-to guides, reference and discussions. And I think the grouper project as a whole, and you think about the wiki, mostly focuses on the reference. And there's some other parts, but we're missing sort of was the discussion, so the context and the why. And that's really where the grouper deployment guide comes in. So this is kind of the outline of the guide. And for this presentation, we're really going to focus it on section 3, 5, and 6, which is giving most of the discussion. I think in the next version of the guide, we have actually a little bit mix in here of the other documentation styles that probably aren't needed any longer, given the progress on tier packaging. So for instance, section 4 probably isn't that relevant anymore, but 3, 5, and 6 for sure definitely are. So we'll focus on those. So the grouper deployment guide, main, I'd say, contribution is in kind of describing the strategy and coming up with some terminology. But we didn't come up with that in a vacuum. So the first is that we based it on 800-162 again. So please go read that document. And then, of course, there was already a fair amount of grouper-specific terminology. And so, what we did was kind of build on top of that and really try to, again, kind of elevate the discussion into sort of IAM concepts. So what can I do with grouper? Well, one of the key things is translating natural language policy, that's what 800-162 describes, into digital policy, right? So down here in the bottom, you see all students, staff, postdocs, and members of the IRB have access to VPN unless their accounts have been locked by the CISO or is in closure process. So that's what they call the natural language policy. And the figure above is really trying to describe or show visually what the digital policy looks like within grouper. And so the overall VPN authorized is the policy group within grouper, and that's composed of a few other groups. I have an authorized allow, which is the allow group, and then a deny, which is a deny group. And within grouper, I can organize those to create effective membership, which is essentially the policy decision about who should have or not have access to the VPN. Another couple neat things that this diagram tries to point out is that if you look at the ref student, all students, and ref faculty, postdocs, and all staff, you see that's being fed automatically from systems of record, so the student information system or HR. So that data and those subject attributes and groups are kept automatically up to date. The one below that, the IRB office, turns out we don't have good institutional data on that, so that's actually a group that's managed by hand by somebody in the IRB office. And then on the right-hand side, we have two other groups, a CISO locked by CISO group, so the CISO could go in and hit the big red button on a particular user. And then also we have some lifecycle policy in our data and access management, and when accounts are being closed, they go through this closure step where we're not really sure they're gone or not, but we're going to turn down the VPN access to see if anybody complains about it or not. So it kind of gives you a nice representation and touches upon a number of the features of the grouper system for access governance. So that's what we're trying to achieve with grouper. And where the grouper deployment guide comes in is, we need a plan and some standards. When you first look at grouper, everything looks like a group. But we're going to use those groups for specific purposes. And so we need some kind of naming and strategy around how we manage those things. And that's where the grouper deployment guide comes in. So some of the terminology out of the grouper deployment guide, we have these things called basis groups. So basis groups would be groups that are formed out of systems of records codes. These are hidden away from access policy. So you could imagine a folder structure with employee codes and student codes. And those codes would never show up in a natural language access policy, right? You would never hear that in that sort of thing. So these codes are really things that typically, if you're doing it access management kind of the traditional way or maybe legacy way, you would see these in some big long PL SQL script or some huge table joins or whatever. And what we want to try to do is pull all that up and make it obvious and accessible to data and access management analysts. So we pull those groups in straight. Sometimes these are called raw groups. And then we use those to build up what we call reference groups. And reference groups are institutionally meaningful cohorts, right? You should think about these as subject attributes. And these would show up in natural language policy, right? So I have a policy that says, the president or the provost or the chaplain has access to these sorts of things, or all faculty and all staff get access to the VPN, or these types of students get access to these types of resources, right? So those are the reference groups. And those reference groups are going to be used in creating other groups, which we call access policy groups. And that's what we find like the VPN allow. So you can kind of see this progression where you have basis groups, which is kind of raw data. They build up institutionally meaningful cohorts, which we call reference groups, which are like subject attributes. And then we create attribute-based access policy, which we call the access policy groups. So this is kind of the key, I think one of the key contributions from the grouper deployment guide, right? We spent a lot of time talking to many schools and working with the grouper development team and with the Tier API working groups and others to really kind of distill community practice into a set of kind of meaningful terminology and strategies. So to show how that kind of manifests itself in grouper, so within grouper, you may be aware you can do this thing called trace membership. So if I go down to my VPN allow policy group down here on the bottom, if I was looking at that group, I could find Thompson OW, I can say trace membership, and this is the screen you get. And so everything in here is a group, but what's important is how we use those things. And again, that's where the grouper deployment guide comes in. So this is the policy group down the bottom, access policy group, VPN allow. And that's composed of a group VPN roles, netadmin. So that's an application-specific role. And so how do I get subjects into that role? And so if you move one layer up, you see netadmins _ allow. And this is where you're doing subject attribute to application role mapping. So in here, I'm going to find a reference group that says, everybody in the ITS in the digital infrastructure department should have access, have the netadmin allow role. And so you won't see, you'll see Bill Thompson in here as kind of an indirect member, right? And you'll see digital infrastructure as a direct member. And so this is how we turn in that natural language policy into digital policy, right? And how we achieve attribute-based access control. If I was removed from the digital infrastructure team, which hopefully won't happen for another 15 years or so, I would automatically lose access to the VPN. And if we added other people to the team, they would automatically get access to the VPN. But the policy statement itself doesn't know anything specifically about that person. So if we look at it from the other way, so this is looking at the members of VPN allow, and you can kind of you squint your eyes down here, you can see, well, this is the access policy. This is all fact staff, all net admins, all service managers. And we also have some ad hoc exceptions where we've delegated particular reference groups out to individuals that can add and remove folks from those, kind of like an ACL, right? So you can kind of mix and match access control strategies within grouper. So this is showing the ad hoc VPN access strategy. And again, these are kind of all delegated groups outs, right? So these are student researchers, and this one would be controlled by Heidi Hedrickson, right? So she would have access to this group and she could add and remove people at will. Okay, so switching gears a little bit. So again, one of the main contributions of the grouper deployment guide is that sort of terminology and strategy and the intent of those kinds of groups. And that overall access strategy can be used in a lot of different ways. And the grouper deployment guide outlines 4 different kinds of access control models that all leverage that same strategy. So I'm going to walk through each one of those. The first thing to note is that the models as presented in the grouper deployment guide, they use a framework. A model comes from ZACML. So ZACML is a standard for access control. It actually takes its model from an earlier RFC that's much older, from 2000, RFC 2904. But basically, they talk about a number of components that are required for access control. And these are highlighted here. So we have a policy administration point. This is where you manage your policies. You have a policy decision point. So this is actually what evaluates the policies based on a request. A policy enforcement point, which is actually enforcing the policies, and then an information point where you might achieve additional attributes or subject attributes about the user or the objects. So this framework is used to create the models in the grouper deployment guide. So the first model is grouper subject attributes, and really with a focus on edge of person affiliation. And in this model, grouper is really simply just used as a policy information point. So you would have edge of person affiliation mastered within grouper, right? And so you'd have, the controlled vocabulary within grouper. So say you have, student or member or whatever it is, and those would be built up from your reference groups. And so when you look in grouper and somebody says, well, who gets this edge of person affiliation attribute or value? You could go into grouper and you could see what your policy is for your institution. And in here, That value is simply sent over to the service provider, and the service provider is responsible for the policy enforcement point, for making the decision, and for the administration. So everything is kind of wrapped up in the service provider here. This particular model is really good when there exists a very loose relationship between the institution and the service provider. And it assumes that both are in the federation, like in common, and that a locally defined notion of edge-person affiliation is sufficient for access control. So if that's all true, then you can enable a fairly broad set of services fairly easily. For us, an example is university tickets. So we have a third party who takes care of tickets for events for the college. And they give discounts based on your edge-person affiliation value. And so they don't really care so much about who is in those, who gets that value as much as we do, but it's an easy way to make that happen. So model 2 is the one that's a little bit more near and dear to our heart. This is the one that we see kind of used almost most prevalently and almost for all of our services. And here you have, and this is also closer to the VPN use case that I just described. So here, Grouper is responsible for a lot more of the access control model, both the policy administration point, the decision point, and information point are all within Grouper, and really just relying on the service provider to do enforcement. So again, this is applicable across a broad range of services, and the VPN example was a good example of this model. We use this for library services, so we have an edge-person entitlement value. The policy is in Grouper. The attribute is reflected into LDAP and then sent along via SAML to the service provider. So a little bit of an aside. So with Access Model 2, even if you have edge-person entitlement values set up and policy enforcement at the service provider based on edge-person entitlement, a lot of times that's good for front door access. But even then, the target service, particularly cloud-based software as a service type setup, almost all the time they still need some kind of account provisioned to the target service. And so you may still be sending edge-person entitlement value for front door access, but the service may still need an account provisioned in that service for one reason or another. And so there's been a lot of work around midpoint, and so this shows a particular way where the policy account group, which would also likely master the edge-person entitlement value, also can drive assignments within midpoint. And then midpoint could then be used to create and synchronize those accounts, right? And this is kind of what really midpoint is really good at doing. There's other ways to do this. In some cases, Grouper has out-of-the-box connectors for various services, and so that's one way. And also another popular way is to use some kind of messaging. At Lafayette, we leverage RabbitMQ and have some in-house provisioning components that we put on the other end of that will create accounts in various systems, both locally and remote. Okay, so access control model 3 is RBAC user to role mapping. So you probably have systems on your campus. One example for us is an enterprise reporting or business intelligence system called Cognos. And any sort of large system is going to come with their own permissions management, role management interface, right? And so in our case for Cognos, you're creating, there's implicit roles within the application, and then you're actually adding additional roles, like so who can see what kind of reports, who can see what kind of data, and so you're creating all these role to permissions mapping at the target service. And that's kind of indicated up here. We're kind of splitting the administration point between the service and Grouper. So the roles to permissions mapping was at the service. So I'm going into my Cognos management interface. And in that interface, I can create new roles and I can map new permissions and provide access to various places or data within the application based on those roles. But what we still need to have done is the user to role mapping. And what typically would happen is, there'd be some manual process, right? Because doing the user to role mapping is often particularly hard to do and hard to keep up to date. And so what we've done here is we've leveraged Grouper, and we do the user to role mapping in Grouper. So that way I can leverage all my reference groups. I can still have attribute-based access policy about who goes into what group and get them in there automatically and get them deprovisioned automatically. And what we do is basically just tie the role name in Grouper to the role name in Cognos. And this slide shows it being delivered via SAML, which could happen. In our case, we're actually doing it via an LDAP intermediary. But the strategy still remains the same, I think, which is the real important part, which is policy is driven is created in Grouper in the same way that all the rest of the access control models are. And then the fourth and final access control model that's described in the Grouper deployment guide is this web single sign-on shortcut, or short circuit. And in this case, you probably come across these cases, and the two kind of main cases are sometimes a service provider doesn't have a very good experience for an unauthorized user, right? So they're going to log into your web single sign-on, and they're going to show up at the service provider, and they're just going to get some kind of error message that isn't particularly helpful or friendly. If you know ahead of time who is authorized and not authorized for that service by managing that policy in Grouper, then you can signal to Shibboleth or your web single sign-on to short circuit the authentication step and redirect to a more friendly unauthorized user page, right? So please contact the help desk or whatever it might say. The other place where we've seen this come into play is when the service provider, for whatever reason, maybe because it's out of your administrative control, or it just simply doesn't have access control sufficient to meet your requirements, you just can't implement that, right? So let's just say you have some kind of service, you're standing it up for the campus, but you only want a particular cohort to use it, let's say students, and you don't want anybody else to use it. But the service provider, for some reason, can't distinguish that, either because, again, it's out of your administrative control, or they just don't have the technical controls to do that. So that's another example where this model could come into play, and you could have your policy within Grouper, and anybody who tried to access that service provider would be denied access. Okay, so this is a diagram of how a tier-based architecture is starting to come into shape at Lafayette. We have co-managed deployed and Grouper deployed and a RabbitMQ provisioning engine and OpenLDAP and CAS and SHIB. And we're still evaluating midpoint, but we think it's going to plug in somewhere near here. The point really, I think, of this slide is that really what I'm trying to show about the component-based architecture of tier, that you can pick and choose and plug in places where it makes sense for your architecture, but also making a call out to the new tier-based Docker deployments. So Lafayette recently went live with the tier Docker version of the SHIB IDP. We did that in July. And that was a major step for us, and has had major improvements in our ability to operate and upgrade. And so we're very pleased with that direction. And the other components are also receiving the same treatment. And so we're looking forward very much to deploying Grouper 2.4 also in a Docker container and kind of continuing to move in that direction. And I wonder if I could maybe just pause here for a moment. I know that Michael Geddes has had some experience with the Grouper tier package. And maybe, Michael, could you share maybe just a little bit of your experience there?
Sure, happy to. I've had the pleasure of making use of the work of Chris Hubing and others in the tier packaging of Grouper, and I was on 2.3, and actually last night I did the work to convert over to 2.4. It was actually a little bit fun. Through Docker, I've got my MariaDB database, and I was able to very easily export the database out of 2.3 into 2.4. And then you start to fire up 2.4, and you have to do a little Docker maneuvering to get the DDL script so that the database updates can be applied. That was fairly trivial to do. And then where I ended up spending most of my time was, following the instructions and going through the VT, Virginia Tech LDAP to LDAPtive conversion. And once I banged my head a few times on that, as we all tend to do, about 15, 20 minutes later, I brought it all came up very nicely, and 2.4 is up and running. I hope I didn't miss any steps in all of that, but it all seems to be hanging together. I'd also mentioned that I've been making quite a bit of use of the new capabilities of Grouper Shell for doing some development work and doing some graphing. And I'll be meeting with Mr. Heiser and other members of the Grouper core development team, I believe, next week to talk about how we can, what to do with possibilities of graphs, kind of like what you see on the display now. And I can show it if you guys want, but being able to truly visualize everything that Bill's been talking about, because it does get complicated in how to look at your policies and how do you know that it really is right and follow the paths of things, and to be able to truly visualize it is quite important and useful. So I hope that addresses what you want, Bill.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike. Okay, so I hope one of the things you'll kind of see and take away about this is, really focusing on subject attribute management and access governance, right? So following the grouper deployment guide, we've arrived at a consistent model and terminology, and you can see the flow from basis to reference to policy groups. Reference groups, you can really think about as subject attributes, right? These are institutionally meaningful cohorts, right? And then policy groups can implement attribute-based access control. You can do role-based access control. You can do access control lists. And then finally, the strategy applies to all 4 access control models, right? I think that's one of the big things that we were really kind of excited to see, that I have a consistent strategy in terms of how I can manage my access policy. I can delegate out reference groups. I can delegate out policy. But in the end, I've got a single access governance interface that we can do audit, and I can trace membership on, and I can just start to get a little bit of better sense of how it is that we're doing access control. So for us, and I think for you, if you follow the strategy, policy is more organized, discoverable, manageable, auditable. That's a major improvement for us. The management of policy is consistent, it's easy, it's flexible, it can be delegated. And ultimately, you're improving your security posture and your ability to onboard new services quickly. And that's kind of the experience that we've had here at Lafayette. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we have teed up a day-long session at TechX coming up on September 28th from 8 to 5, entitled Tier Access Governance with Grouper and Friends, where we're going to dive a lot deeper into the topics we've discussed here, and have created some really great hands-on labs that we're going to walk through during the day, and really start from kind of the very beginning of kind of Grouper concepts and capabilities, and show how those can be applied as a strategy using the Grouper deployment guide, and ultimately ending in the afternoon with an access governance practicum based on real-world use cases, where you'll be able to see how it really all comes together and get a sense of what it feels like to operate a tier-based access governance system based on Grouper and the other components. So we'll pull in Shibboleth and LDAP and Midpoint and RabbitMQ and others. So it's going to be pretty cool, and it should be pretty fun. And if nothing else, after 5 o'clock, we can all go hit the bar. So I hope to see many of you there.
Bill, I'm going to jump in with a quick question from Jeffrey, asking
Please.
about, can you speak to delegation strategy and how that relates to the app org stem?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And so delegation, there's lots of different facets to that. And in terms of the org stem, in some larger deployments where there's you have huge, you have big pieces of your IT organization are distributed, right? So say like in a larger university, you may pull off that org folder stem and kind of hand that off to like another IT organization within the university. And so in that case, it's almost as if you're providing Grouper as a service to that organization. And what you would probably expect to see is kind of the root of the Grouper tree recreated underneath that org, right? So for instance, if you're a big piece of the organization, like say the engineering and sciences had their own IT organization, and they wanted to make use of Grouper and really kind of like totally be responsible. They had their own IAM folks or a person, and they're going to be responsible for kind of services within their own domain. You could use that folder to basically set them up as root for their own folder within Grouper. So that's one way. Another way, not so ambitious, is there may be cases where you have reference groups that are kind of specific to an organization, or even applications that may be specific to an organization that you might want to organize in that way. And again, mostly it speaks to the security context. I didn't speak to it too much in this presentation, but the folder set and the folder tree is what creates the security context for doing delegation. And so there may be reasons why you might want to put an application under an org folder or a reference group under an org folder to facilitate that kind of access.
As some of our astute attendees have noted, unfortunately, the date is incorrect. It's not September 28th. It's October 15th for the access governance session.
Oh boy, yes, thank you.
There's another question regarding, will there be a connector to do loader jobs from Workday?
October 15th, is that right?
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Chris, not sure if you want to try and take that on, or?
Yeah, I think if you wanna send an email to the list and tell me more about that, we can talk about it. Penn is installing Workday too, so I would think people would be interested in something like that.
And given the inbound capabilities of messages into Grouper, that might be a nice way of handling things like that. But so loader jobs versus getting real-time messaging and so on. Any other questions? I don't see anything else in the chat room. Nope. Are there connectors for Okta already? Haven't looked. I guess given the silence, we don't know either.
Yeah, I haven't heard of it, but I was just gonna say I'm not aware of any, or haven't heard of any, but I guess the question I would have is, so you're thinking about and Okta, and maybe I'm not that familiar with Okta, but I thought it was basically a web single sign-on service where you might want to control who gets access to which services driven by Grouper policy. Is that maybe what somebody's thinking?
They'd have to type fairly quickly.
Yeah, or it could be, they manage their users in Okta, and you want to be able to assign, assign those people to groups or something like that. And I would just say that there are certain things that Grouper does in a standard way through SQL or through LDAP, and so sometimes, like from Workday, you might be exporting your data to a warehouse anyway. So if it's in SQL, then you could load from that. But yeah, there could be a more native way to do that as well. And Okta too, if there's some sort of LDAP interface, so there's a way to access those users and get it in a way that Grouper can already use, then you could do that. But if people already have experience with something like that, we'd like to hear about it. Or if there's some sort of a more tight integration that we can do, we're interested to help.
And much like, say, Carnegie Mellon, Brown, New Hampshire, and others have done, there's various identity management solutions out there. They've got their own ways of doing things, but even Grouper can integrate into those identity management solutions to help augment and layer on top of a set of capabilities that those environments of whatever it is that you're implementing don't really supply. So just because you're getting some existing identity management solution doesn't mean you couldn't make effective use of Grouper in your environment. So we have something here from Nathan for sites that aren't sending people to TechX. Are other training sessions planned, kind of like SHIB Fests?
This is Dean, Michael. I guess I can take that one. We're actually working on, we being Internet 2 and In Common, are working on a schedule for 2019 that we hope to include. We're going to orient it around the tier software, so Shibboleth, Grouper, and CoManage at least. Don't really have any details yet or how that's going to be structured, but we recognize it's a huge need in the community, so that's something we're going to focus on next year.
From Garrett, maybe more of a community question, but do folks tend to allow service owners who have delegated rights over their application groups to discover reference groups and link them to their application groups? Or does this tend to be a linkage that is managed by Grouper IAM admins? And if you don't mind, I'll just quickly jump in with it. At least in my experience, there's usually some small set of groups that you don't necessarily want the average person or app admin to be able to get their hands on, because especially in larger institutions, they can be large, like all students, all staff, etc. And you might want to better control how those get inserted into other groups, because of course, when you take a group of all students and you put that into another group, you're generating many thousands of changes. And when these things happen, you might want to be a little sensitive to that. And that's one reason why you might want to control access. But it all depends on your environment. And Bill and Chris, do you guys have experiences with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're rightly to point out that it greatly depends, I think, on the context. I think in Lafayette's case, what we have going is that most of the time the policy, the translation from natural language policy to digital policy and actually creating that setup within Grouper is done by the IAM analyst. And in the cases where we have kind of sort of delegated management, it's almost always about an application-specific reference group or an application-specific, or like a departmental reference group or something like that. And in those cases, the delegation is to the kind of the ACL, right? It's to the application-specific reference group, which might be a team or a role within the group that somebody's managing by hand, or some kind of exception group that somebody's managing by hand. And so in our cases, we haven't kind of had an issue that Michael's describing where, we have overly broad access to the reference groups. We have started to, experiment a little bit, still kind of fairly close at hand within ITS where, folks have more administrative access or roles to, say, a particular service where they might be able to kind of see those things, but it's still kind of kept fairly close at hand.
I would just say, Penn, one of the exceptions is some of our school or centers, like when you delegate to an org, they're power users of that school or center. We give them read access to some of our reference groups, and then they don't have to, they can understand what they are and help people use them. But generally, yeah, the app owners would have to go through a data analyst to try to help them see exactly what they want and just make sure they're doing the right thing.
And as Jeffrey notes in the chat room, a previous job, it was a matter of allowing access to, like architects and so on. And he's rightly pointing this out, that some training may be necessary, like in FERPA, because again, you have to be aware of when you add, say, the students to a group, how is that data really going to be used? So FERPA issues may come into play depending on where that data is going. So it's not just as simple as go add a group. It's so who's in the group and what's that group being used for. Any other questions out there looming? We really don't have to take up all the time. Well, I guess we'll start on the closing of things. Take a couple of minutes to complete the evaluation of IAM Online. Link appears on your screen. We use these evaluations to improve the webinar series and to gather potential topics for the future. Before people run away, I do want to pay particular attention to our friends in North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia who have a tiny little storm bearing down on them. Everyone, please stay safe. The annual technology exchange is in Orlando, October 15 through 19. We'll have 2 tracks of trust and identity topics and the Unconference Advanced Camp. And that's it for today. I'd like to thank Mr. Thompson and Mr. Heiser for their continued great work, and also to the rest of the group or team. Thank you for all that you do. And I hope everyone has a great day.
Excellent. Thanks, Michael. And thanks again to Bill and Chris. Have a good day, everybody.